Thank you very much, High Commissioner for Planning in Morocco, Mr. Ahmed Lahlimi. Thank you for your generous introduction, but most importantly, thank you very much for gathering an illustrious gathering of people to apply our minds not only to what Morocco will look like in the year 2030, but how the entire coastal regions of the Atlantic Ocean should plan for the future. I think it is forward-looking, I think it is innovative, and I think it is urgent that we do our work with the kind of clarity that is required. We have an illustrious panel here today to discuss this very important topic of the knowledge economy, migration, and mutual understanding. I am in a difficult position because the starting time of a session is often arbitrary. But the organizers are always strict about the ending time of a session, which means that the pressure on those who speak is enormous, because you come with expectations of 15 minutes for your presentation, and you end up with 10 minutes for your presentation. The more difficult position I find myself in is that I am both a chairperson and a presenter. As a chairperson, I may have the power to abuse time when I do my presentation, but I also have the responsibility to set an example. And so between those, I need to try and manage the session so that we end by 13:30. And to see how we can extract in this 1.5 hours some of the key thoughts that I think revolve around the challenge of migration. Someone used a very beautiful term earlier on when they spoke about the mobility of people as opposed to migration. And I think that the challenge we face is that we live in a world that enjoys the mobility of ideas. They enjoy the way in which information crosses boundaries. They enjoy and welcome the way in which capital crosses boundaries. Financial systems are integrated and globalized. We welcome the way in which goods are traded across boundaries from continent to continent. And having opened up all our borders to ideas, to information, to capital, and to goods, we want to close the borders. When people are as mobile as ideas, capital, and goods in this globalized world that we are in, we see the mobilization of right-wing forces to stop the flow of people. We see some of the most pernicious ways in which the world tries to manage the mobility of people. And I think that what Morocco says to us today is, rather than spit into the wind, let us see how we plan for the inevitability of the mobility of people in the world that we live in. And so, what we have spent the last 2 days discussing are various responses and planning responses and constructive responses to the crises that the world faces. We all acknowledge that there's a global financial and economic crisis. We have started to acknowledge that there's an ecological crisis. We have seen sometimes the wrong ways in which countries have managed the crisis of security and conflict in the world. But there is a silent crisis of social cohesion if we do not plan for the mobility of people. And I think that this session is an attempt to start planning to avert a crisis and to reduce a crisis that emerges from the mobility of people. I want to say that we are at the beginning of a next phase of major demographic shifts in the world. We are being told that by 2050, the world's population would have increased from just over 6 billion to 9 billion people. More importantly, we are told that that population growth will happen in the developing world, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. Africa's share of the world, sub-Saharan Africa's share of the world population will increase from 10% to 19%. The questions we face is whether sub-Saharan Africa's education systems are geared up to turn what is a labor market into a skilled labor force, and whether sub-Saharan Africa's economic capability is going to be able to absorb that labor force. Demographists also tell us that you are having the opposite effect in the developed world, particularly in Europe, where there's a population growth slowdown, but you're having an enormous aging phenomenon. More people are getting older, and more people are leaving the skilled occupations and effectively creating a skills and labor vacuum in places like Europe. If one looks particularly at an example of Morocco, then one would understand that a country like Morocco have contributed by 2005 just about 2.7 million workers, first-generation migrants to Europe. What it means is that Moroccans are beginning to fill vacuums that are existing in Europe, while at the same time, Morocco has become a recipient of lower-skilled labor from sub-Saharan Africa and other places that are facing population growth. Of course, in one way this is good for Morocco because the amount of remittances that Morocco receives has grown phenomenally from 1980, when $8.8 billion worth of remittances returned from the Moroccan diaspora. To Morocco, it's grown in 2007 to $28.5 billion. But I think that what we are beginning to do here is to see how do we plan for these demographic shifts. And these demographic shifts will happen because, on the one hand, there are conflicts in the world that displace people. On the other hand, there's an economic crisis that creates people unemployed and unemployable. On the other hand, there's an ecological crisis where pressure on water, pressure on food security, pressure on rising sea levels, pressure from droughts, and so forth, are also beginning to displace people. And the challenge we face is how do we plan for it, rather than allow the unintended consequences of the mobility of people being exploited for political gain, as will happen in the European Parliament elections. How do we ensure that we create the basis for social cohesion so that host countries and migrants are prepared for this mobility that will occur? And how do we create institutions within our society where we are able to manage some of these things? I want to leave my opening remarks at that level. And whatever else I want to say, I would do as concluding remarks. But I thought that I wanted to set the scene for this discussion so that we deal with mobility of people as an inevitability and not something that we can simply wish against. That we begin to plan for it, not only for how people will move, under what conditions people will move, and where people will move to, but that we also begin to plan so that the mobility of people does not give rise to conflicts of culture, conflicts of identity, conflicts of religion, and misperceptions about migrants replacing indigenous and native labor systems that is exploited then by politicians. And so I thought that with those remarks, I want to welcome you and to introduce to you the first of our speakers. He is Mr. Dries Al-Yazami. He's the president of the Council for Moroccan Communities Abroad, and I hope he's not going to correct me about the 2.7 million of his members that I projected would be in Europe. Maybe it has grown, maybe I've overstated it, but I'm hoping 3. Well, the High Commissioner for Planning has said that it has grown to 3 million Moroccans in Europe. But I think that from that perspective, we could begin to understand how we plan for the mobility of people. So thanks very much. Mr. Dries Al-Yazami, the floor is yours for the next 10 to 12 minutes.